Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. We're going to be hearing from Adam Boileau, and we'll be talking through all the week's news in just a moment, and then we'll be hearing from this week's sponsor. And this week's show is brought to you by Nucleus Security, who you have heard on the show over the last sort of 6 or 7 years. They make a platform that helps you ingest, normalize, triage vulnerability information in your organization. That can be in anything that's coming out of your SAST, right through to like stuff that's coming out of Tenable and whatnot, like a master console for vulnerability information. And Nucleus's co-founder, Scott Kufer, is joining us for this week's sponsor interview. And we're talking about how the whole approach of the last 5 years, which is to like just prioritize which bugs you're going to fix, how that is sort of becoming insufficient these days because, you know, we did that in response to too many bugs being present in our environment. So we just focused on the high priority ones. He's going to come along and argue that now there's too many high priority ones to really keep up with as well. And we kind of need to rethink that approach. We'll also talk about how AI is changing SAST and whatnot, which is something we're going to touch on in the news as well. That one's coming up later. But first up, yeah, Adam, let's get into it. And look, a bit of terrific, it felt really old school Twitter InfoSec drama on X. FFmpeg kicked off this huge debate in the what's left of the InfoSec community on Twitter when Google reported a bug or some bugs to FFmpeg that they discovered with their sort of DeepMind AI bug finding stuff. And FFmpeg were like, hey, submit a patch instead. Like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? We're a small volunteer-led organization. Why are you doing this to us? Can't you be more helpful? And, you know, the response from a lot of people in the security field was predictable, where they were saying it's not our job to patch your software. But then other people were saying, well, hang on, you know, Google is a absolutely gigantic, you know, hundreds of billions, what is it, $1 trillion company or something? You know, maybe they could be a little bit more helpful here. My question for you is, have you been following it, and which side of the debate did you land on?
I have seen it. It's spilled out beyond Twitter and into some of the other, you know, into Blue Sky and other places. So I have been following along with the drama. And we do love a good disclosure drama. Like, that's always fun. You know, vuln drama, good times. I guess my feeling is there are many, many ways to do open source software and many different communities with different priorities. And, you know, some open source projects, security is really important to them. I'm thinking, you know, like stuff that came out of the OpenBSD world, for example, like OpenSSH or SSL, OpenSSL. You know, for them, security is super important. They take that real seriously. It's kind of part of their deal. You know, other projects just kind of like you're there having a good time. You're there for fun. You're there for community. They have other priorities. And for them, I can imagine that, you know, interacting with the modern security research community or the security world, especially in the AI, you know, environment, you know, probably could be a little frustrating. And I think, you know, in the end where I landed was, you know, it's just the kind of like, you do you thing. Like, you know, if you don't want to receive bug reports for your open source software, that's fine. You can just say that on your bug, you know, on your how to report security issues page. You can be like, just stick them in the bug tracker like everything else. And there's some projects that have done that. And others, you know, take it a bit more seriously. And, you know, FFmpeg, I think, is an interesting case just because of, you know, they are such a ubiquitous bit of video software and Google has such a long history as a user of.
Well, I mean, this is kind of what you were saying, which is that like, oh, well, you know, for projects where security is important, like FFmpeg is absolutely everywhere and baked into all sorts of stuff. So bugs in it are a big deal, but we're in this situation where the people who are, you know, creating and maintaining this software, like it's not, as you say, it's not like OpenSSH or something where, you know, they're thinking of security as being a key requirement.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, we are talking about in this case, you know, like really obscure video codecs and other stuff that Google's finding bugs in because, you know, Google's fuzzing infrastructure and AI vuln hunting, whatever, you know, is capable of looking at the entire code base and trying to find bugs. And, you know, it's going to improve the quality of everything. And, you know, as to whether security researchers are good at writing patches, like that's a whole other kind of conversation.
Well,
I think,
yeah. Look, that's been the response from a lot of people on the sort of security camp side of this, which is that, well, you know, if you're a security researcher, you don't understand the context of everything in a project. And look, that's a fair argument. But look, I in broad terms, and this might surprise some people listening to this actually, I think this is the first interesting disclosure debate we've had in like 10 years, like if I'm honest. But I think broadly, I kind of fall on the FFmpeg side of this a little bit more, which is, you know, if you want to do security research that's helpful, you know, just grabbing a bunch of bugs out of an AI model and dumping them onto busy people who don't get paid to fix them, I think is just not helpful. Right? Like, now, does this mean that, you know, you would expect Google to write patches for, you know, huge companies that have open source components? Like, no, of course not, right? But I think in this case, they could have done a little bit more to be helpful. Now, does that mean they need to write the patch? Maybe not. Does that mean they could, you know, work with them, throw some resources there? Well, I don't know, man. And you'd surely think, given the focus of like, the DARPA AI challenge and whatever, which is not just about finding bugs, but about patching them. You would think, hey, maybe if you Google, you wait until that part of it is working properly before you push the button and start spitting out bugs. You know, wait till it can spit out patches as well. You know, surely that's coming soon.
I mean, yeah, that is absolutely an avenue of research that people are going down. And I guess, you know, the argument against that is like those bugs are there already. People are already finding them. Like even just by reporting them, you are improving the situation, even if you're not providing a fully fledged fix or patch or whatever else. And, you know, quite a bit of this I feel like is, you know, open source communities are communities, right? And when an outsider comes in this case, you know, Google is somewhat the outsider here and starts, you know, doing things in a way that's outside of the norm for that community, then of course they get rejected. There's this tension, this friction in those communities. And, you know, it's not necessarily the place for security researchers to have to understand all of those community dynamics, right? I mean, just showing up saying like, here's a bug we found, you know, I think if you show up and say, here is a 90-day disclosure timeline,
which is what they do.
Which is what they do, right? That's kind of a different, because you're making demands of them and you have no relationship with them on which to base those demands, modulo Google's relationship with FFmpeg. But I mean, like in the general sense, if you show up and start making demands, then that's just kind of rude. And, you know, these communities are ultimately about good neighborliness, right? And that's, you know, what open source is for. And so, you know, when you show up and, you know, disrespect the community by not following their guidelines, by not, you know, if they expect you to provide patches, not just bug reports or whatever else, like you kind of show up at their house, you got to play by their rules a little bit. And, you know, I think, you know, there's a lot of people in Google in Deep Sleep and, you know, in DeepMind and Big Sleep, the bug researchy bit, Project Zero, like, you know, Google understands the cultural context of this, but they're just trying to do it at scale. And that has some rough edges. And I think, you know, ultimately the people at Google doing this work, you know, it's absolutely good faith work. It's not, you know, a lot of open source projects have been burnt by really low value AI slop bug submissions and things by people who are trying to make a name for themselves, you know, just start.
Look, I'm going to just stop you there because I think just because someone thinks they're acting in good faith doesn't necessarily mean they are acting in good faith. And I think that's the problem here, is that too many people on the security side of this say, well, look, we're helping. We're helping because we're pointing out your bad, dirty mistakes, and we're going to rub your nose in your bad, dirty mistakes because we're so smart and we're helping. And I think, is that helping?
We're not very helpful.
That's not very helpful.
You know, I agree.
Now, I also think every time this spills into a debate, people want to come up with hard and fast rules. Yeah. You and I were actually chatting about this yesterday, just on a call we had, where it sort of breaks our little Antipodean brains somewhat, that the Americans want to turn everything into a flowchart and a rigid policy. Now, in certain circumstances, you want to have a crack at that, like the vulnerabilities equities process within the intelligence community is a great example of where you do want a flowchart and a bit of a rigid policy. But when it comes to stuff like this, you know, I think giving FFmpeg the same disclosure terms as like Fortinet, I don't know, it just feels a little bit dumb. I mean, grugq put it best, I think, in a tweet that he posted that said the current drama is, you know, plucky security researcher Google takes on volunteer open source behemoth FFmpeg, right? I think we would all benefit if we just used our brains and common sense a little bit when it comes to this stuff. And I would urge, you know, a lot of the AI companies now to really focus on that patching part. Right? Because one of the beautiful things about AI is it should be possible to get AI to at least suggest some patches or come up with some guidance on how to fix these issues. Like, that's one of the magical things about it. So why don't we just take a beat, try to get the technology to a point where we're not just deluging people in bugs. And I'm not saying that's what Google's done to FFmpeg in this case. I think a lot of this is just grumpy FFmpeg Twitter account manager, right? Like, I think a lot of that, there's a lot of that to this. But I do think there's something here where, maybe we need to move on from some of these, rigidly held beliefs about what does and does not constitute helping.
Yeah. I agree. This is not a one-size-fits-all thing. And if you're reporting a bug to, say, curl, that Badger does an amazing job of managing that project and has done an amazing job of documenting its security properties and takes security really, seriously. If you're reporting a bug to him, you're going to handle it differently than if you're reporting it to someone's hobbyist 1990s decoder for obscure video format, right? And, that nuance does kind of get lost at scale. Unfortunately, those nuances are super important to communities. And I think you're right that, Google's 90-day, we are going to disclose bugs after 90 days. That had some very good reasons why they went down that road, but those reasons are not about little open source projects, right? They are about big corps. They are about people whose incentives to bury bugs are different than open source projects, where it is ultimately about showing up and being a good neighbor and a good community member.
Yeah, I mean, I think the funniest one was Tavis Ormandy, coming out of retirement, basically to say, oh, well, FFmpeg better fix this or they'll have to explain why one of their developers got owned with this bug. And it's just come on, man. Come on. And full props actually to Rob Graham, Errata Rob, who is who I don't agree with on everything, right? But he's a wonderful contrarian. It's good to have those people around. And he's currently rolling his sleeves up right now and working on a patch for the FFmpeg issue, which I think is just a great example of someone just going, okay, you know what? I'll do it. That's fine. I'll do it.
That's kind of the boss move, right? It's you see this debate on Twitter, fine, I'm gonna go patch this stuff for you. I'll see you in a week with a pull request, which I can't argue with that. Good job, sir.
Yeah, I mean, there's a time to argue and there's a time just to fire up a debugger, right? Yes. And Rob also managed to get featured by Menswear Guy on X this week as well. So hell of a week for Rob Graham. Hello to you too, if you're listening. And look, staying on the theme of AI and bug hunting, OpenAI has launched, I think it's a beta at this point, but they've got their agentic security researcher that they've called Aardvark. Dave Vitale is involved in that. It looks like it's pretty promising stuff, a different approach to the way Google's doing it, where they're sort of using AI to drive other approaches like fuzzing and whatever, where OpenAI say that their model is much more a reasoning model that is capable of sort of understanding software rather than just throwing existing sort of fuzzing harnesses and whatnot at it. I don't know which is the better approach. I got no idea. But the point is, there's a lot of work happening in this space and it is extremely promising. It's something that I mentioned in this week's sponsor interview as well, but I think it was around 6 months ago, a founder who I've worked with, I won't name him because I just haven't checked if I can name him. And I told you about this at the time. He was playing around with open source models and trying to get them to substitute for SAST, right? And it worked so well. He's like, I'm not going to bother trying to raise or build anything around this because it took me a couple days to put something together with existing models that worked so unbelievably well and so much better than the existing SAST stuff. So his thoughts were twofold. First of all, there's no money to be made here for anyone outside the AI companies. And his second thought was, SAST is over, right? Which, I mean, you look at what these guys are doing and you sort of think there might be something to that.
Yeah, this, OpenAI obviously is kind of a giant in terms of research into difficult AI problems, and AI bug hunting and fixing and so on. There's very real research to be done there. And I know when Dave Attell, who I used to work for, said he was signing up to go work at OpenAI, I was curious to see what he was working on. And now we've, in the last few days, we've seen that. I believe it's in a private beta, so you have to ask nicely and they pick. So we haven't really seen other people outside of OpenAI using it. They're also, their approach to reporting about the sorts of bugs they're finding is different than, say, Google, where, Google is tagging bugs in bug reports, say was found with, Big Sleep or whatever it's called. OpenAI are not publicizing the bugs that they are finding other than, cherry picking a few here and there. They did find apparently an off by one in SSH, OpenSSH, which, that's a code base that's had a lot of eyes on it over the years.
Well, I'll just say too, I did notice a conspicuous paragraph in there in light of what of this FFmpeg drama, which is, I'll just read it here. It says, we recently updated our outbound coordinated disclosure policy, which takes a developer-friendly stance focused on collaboration and scalable impact rather than rigid disclosure timelines that can pressure developers. And this is something that I think is interesting. I feel like we do need to move on from the idea, from the days where you would sort of disclose things in a punitive way, right?
Yeah.
Especially to open source projects. When it comes to your bigger companies, Microsofts and Palo Altos and whatever, fair enough. But I think, I don't think we can flowchart this anymore, and we've got to start using our heads. And it looks like this is actually what OpenAI is doing.
Yeah, and it's great to see, and there are people involved there that do understand the social dynamics and all of the kind of complexities, and there are so many weird incentives around vulnerability disclosure. It's why we have these disclosure arguments so often. I mean, not so often on the show, but on the internet generally, because there are so many people's equities and feelings and careers and all those kinds of things involved. But yeah, this is really interesting. I'm curious to see what people do with this model. I'm curious to see where OpenAI kind of takes the work on it. And Dave Attell's been doing a little bit of publicity around it. He was talking about the difference between Google's quite fuzzing, heavy, sort of historical kind of approach to bug hunting. Like Google had all of the compute in the world, they had all of the PDF files in the world, and they had all of the PDF reading software. Why not permute all of those? And they had this long history of fuzzing as a successful approach. Whereas and I think their AI models build on that legacy, whereas OpenAI kind of starting from a clean slate. And Dave, in particular, has a very long, he has a track record of building good hackers at Immunity, obviously the NSA before that. Like, he knows how to turn, aspiring punk kids into great security researchers. And that's kind of, I imagine, what the process feels like a little bit at OpenAI, right? They've got, as you say, a bunch of midwits and turning them into legitimate hackers who can find interesting bugs and novel bug classes and all that kind of thing. It's just super cool research.
Yeah.
And
they have infinity work experience, kids. Now teach them how to do static analysis, right?
Yeah. And I like it also, we only ever see the models kind of on the outside with cost constraints in front of them. Like, you and I are not going to go spend $100,000 on OpenAI compute time to ask questions, right? So we get to the, the dollar grade answer. Whereas Dave Attell's like, we want to have a model where you can just I want to spend $500,000 worth of compute and I will get a $500,000 bug out of it. Like, some that kind of linear amount of brain you put in is the amount of quality you get out. And it must be amazing being on the inside of some of these research projects where you don't have that dollar constraint quite so, it's not your personal credit card. So you're not, you're a little bit more YOLO with it. And that must be quite a fun process. So,
yeah,
I'm looking forward to seeing what people do once, some people get into the beta and start to play with it and talk about what they're finding.
Yeah, and I'll just say too, for those who aren't au fait, SAST, when I was talking about SAST being dead earlier, that's static application security testing, basically software where you put your code in and it tries to find bugs where, the tools now, honestly, the coverage isn't perfect. I mean, it's pretty good. Some of these tools are pretty good, but I think the AI stuff is going to be a lot better. Now, staying with the AI theme, we've actually just seen Bugcrowd acquire a company called Mayhem Security, and this is a company that won the 2016 DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge. Now, it's interesting, though, because they're like, yeah, they've acquired this company and all 11 employees are coming over to Bugcrowd. Then you look at the numbers and you realize that these guys have raised $36 million prior to their acquisition and have 11 employees. So there was a $21 million B round in 2022 and a Series A, 15 million Series A in 2019. So clearly things have not gone well for this company. Had a bit of a poke around. You can see if you looked at LinkedIn trends and whatever, the number of people reporting to work there has just been in decline for years. However, the reason I find it interesting to talk about this is I think not only is AI an existential threat to these SaaS companies, I would be very nervous as the shareholder of a bug bounty company right now. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the types of bugs that are most often reported through bug bounties, it's the sort of stuff that AI is really good at finding. Now, there's obviously the exceptions there. There's the top 20 people who work across the bug bounty platforms and find exotic, hard stuff, right? You and I know people who do that, make a killing do that, and I don't think AI will necessarily replace them. But that's not most of bug bounties, right? Most of bug bounties is, a lot of it, frankly, is labor arbitrage, where you can get people in lower cost locations like India are, ripping through code, having a look at websites for simple issues. It's a scale thing, and AI does scale. So I think I absolutely understand why it's appealing for Bugcrowd to buy what is essentially a distressed asset here with expertise in this sort of AI stuff. But geez, I'm real curious to see how the next few years pan out for companies like Bugcrowd and HackerOne, because I think they're up against the wall at this point, and maybe they'll be able to bring it back by pivoting into AI. But then are they bug bounty companies, or are they competing with, others like Horizon 3 is a good example. We had them in a snake oil list recently where they're the sort of AI-based pen testing. So you get this really crazy situation where you've got pen testing, vulnerability scanning, recon, sort of like census Shodan style recon, and bug bounties all sort of collapsing, I think, into a single type of, exposure detection product that's AI driven. It's amazing. It's really cool. We're a few years into this AI stuff now. You're starting to see how it's unfolding, and it is going to change so much. It really is. I think people need to stop being as skeptical as they are.
Yeah. And I think, and the more we start to see, legitimate, in the security industry specific uses really start to be, deployed widely and valued widely, because like there's so much experimental stuff, so many people kind of working out in the research spaces that, there's a lot of stuff that's, trying fast and failing fast. But as that kind of settles down, and I think you're right, the sorts of work that you get out of bug bounty platforms probably is a pretty good candidate for being replaced by small machines. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And I'm sure there are also a great many other problems inside Bugcrowd as a company, that a team of AI people could probably help them with. Like everybody's got interesting problems to solve there. So we're going to see how it turns out for them.
Yeah. I mean, I will say too that like this doesn't mean I think that AI valuations at the moment are at all sane, and I think a lot of the predictions around exactly how useful it's going to be everywhere all the time, like we are way too early to know how they're going to bear out. But I'll give you an example. I told you earlier, I was just really curious. I'm a car guy, right? So you might Google a car fact, and I was trying to look at the lap time around the Nürburgring of one car versus another car, and it told me car A was the fastest with a time of 7 minutes 25.5, and car B was the slowest with a lap time of 7:25, which is a faster lap time. So it can't, and this is just a Google Gemini result and whatever, but it's not impressive. I think I may have mentioned on the show once, but I was Googling to solve a problem with my EV, and the Google AI told me to check the fuel pump, and I just sort of think, this is
you're getting the answer that is proportional to the amount of money you paid for those Gemini results, which is nothing.
Yeah.
Right, you looked at some ad, put your eyeballs on some ad, and that's how much value you got out of it. So, I think, it must just be wild to not be cost constrained and to see what the possibilities of the stuff are. And the rest of us are stuck out here using the pennies models and seeing trash results.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got so much potential to do so much cool stuff. I just don't know that it's that whole AGI, generic artificial intelligence. Like, will we get there? I don't know. Maybe. Who knows, right? Who can say? But are we there yet? Are we going to get there in 6 months? Like, no, that ain't happening. And meanwhile, AI shares are at infinity valuations. So it's going to be an interesting few months. Let's just leave it at that. Now let's talk about malicious insiders. We're going to have a bit of an update on the Peter Williams situation. We spoke about that last week. But wow, there's been a new DOJ indictment drop where like a incident responder and like a ransomware negotiator in the United States have been arrested for doing ransomware, and it looks like they're facing up to 50 years in federal prison, which, I mean, play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
Yeah, exactly. And people who work in this industry, like work in, dealing with incident response and dealing with, ransomware and stuff, like you would kind of hope understand that ecosystem a little better than average, and the amount of, of finding out that you're going to do if you play this game, especially when you're in the US, like it just does not seem well thought through. And I guess it probably wasn't. But yeah, these guys, are certainly not, they're certainly looking at some pretty serious time. And I think there's another unnamed, so there's 2 employees, and there's another third one that we haven't seen a name or other details of, but there was another conspirator involved who was the one that actually set them up with affiliate accounts with Alfie, Black Hat ransomware crew. But I just can't imagine going to work, working on a ransomware case and thinking, you know what, I really wish I was in this game making that money too. Like, incident responders get paid well. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing?
Yeah,
buddy?
and the total take here is like 1.3 mil because they got one payment across 3 victims. Which, 1.3 between 2, I mean, like, it's not worth 50 years,
No,
like that
really
risk.
not.
It's just, 1.3 mil seems to be the magic number too, because that's how much Peter Williams got paid.
It just makes no sense. Like,
Cursed,
just go to work and do your
criminality
job, buddy.
number.
Jeez.
Anyway, so look, we've got subsequent, we've got some follow-up reporting too on the Peter Williams, the Trenchant leaker, or, the spy, mole, whatever you want to call him. Kim Zeta has written up a piece here saying that apparently he was still selling stuff after he knew that stuff that he'd passed on to this broker was being on-sold by a broker in South Korea, which is pretty crazy. We do know too, I think it was just sort of being discussed at the time we recorded last week, that the company that he sold these bugs to was OpZero, which is a Russian broker, which, like, it's one of those ones that, like, advertises on Twitter saying, we'll give you $500,000 for these sort of bugs. And it really does look like he just emailed these guys and said, yeah, okay, I got some bugs for you, which is just insane. Like, I do wonder too, 2022, stock market did badly, crypto got wiped out. I wonder if he hit money trouble. Like, that's my personal pet theory, is that he hit some sort of absolutely colossal money trouble and needed cash quickly, but still nuts. Lorenzo also has a write-up here at TechCrunch about how Peter Williams was able to steal this stuff. I mean, there's absolutely nothing surprising here. He was the general manager, which meant he had super user access to everything, which is what a general manager does. I mean, you would have also been completely unsurprised by this, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I was totally unsurprised. I mean, and the specific details of, like using USB storage devices to move stuff in and out of air-gapped environments. I mean, that's how it's done. And so, yeah, you can't reasonably expect a place like that to protect against, as you say, the general manager who's got access to everything. Putting controls in place that can manage that is not necessarily realistic. You just got to trust people and assume that they're not going to go and sell your stuff out for pennies on the dollar. And I think we saw some numbers here on like what the value of the bugs that he sold were. It was something like $35 million worth of
Well, they
value
say that's the loss. So I don't know if that's the development cost of the exploits or the development cost plus the replacement cost or, legal impairments. You got no idea. But yeah, that is the number that's been thrown around.
Yeah, and that, at least it's a number you can compare to the, mill and change he actually managed to get out of the Russian exploit broker. Although apparently they had promised him more and he hadn't managed to get it, actually get that through, or maybe we're not seeing the full extent of the funds. Maybe
he got shortchanged by some shady Russian brokers. Say it ain't so. I mean, that's unbelievable. Now, look, I also wanted to update you all because, last week I said that John Scott Railton from Citizen Lab was questioning the utility of the private sector in this ecosystem, which I think I called it brain dead at the time. John actually got in touch and we wound up having a very long phone conversation. Actually, on my Friday evening, we spoke for something like an hour and a half. Very pleasant conversation. He says that's not his opinion. Forgive my confusion though, Adam, because I sent you a post of his and asked you, do you think it's saying that? And you agree with me, which is it says, I'll just read it. His post says, there's a push to scale up America's offensive industry right now, but this alleged betrayal raises an urgent question. Can these profit maximizers reliably act as trusted stewards of long-term national security? And just how well are they overseen and vetted? So, look, I think that there's an implication there that, a regular person reading that would say this guy doesn't think the private sector should be involved in developing these exploits, but he says, no, that's not what he means. So we did chat for a while. It was an interesting conversation, actually. He does seem really skeptical that this could have happened in from a government agency, which I don't see that at all. We've seen this happen in government agencies. Vault 7 was exactly this, We saw it with shadow brokers as well. We saw it with Edward Snowden. Now, of course, things, I'm guessing it's a little bit trickier to do that sort of thing now, but are you telling me if Rob Joyce, being a GM equivalent when he ran TAO, wanted to walk out with some exploits, he could. Like, he absolutely could. And there's only so far you can go with securing a workforce in those sorts of environments before people start to resign. If you're going to be cavity searching them every time they want to leave to go to the car park, they're going to quit. They're not going to stick around, right? And I've heard of situations where people have quit in response to these sorts of changes in security environments at various places. Like, I really do see this Trenchant leak as something more akin to a leak out of the intelligence community, because they really do sort of operate as an extension of the IC. They're not like a paragon. They're not like some little shop. They are really a trusted player. John expressed to me a lot of concern about, a lot of rhetoric in the US at the moment about rapidly expanding the OffSec space. I think there's going to be tricky to do that, to be honest, because there's already a pretty hard limit on the number of people who can do this work. I also think there's some pretty good controls in there already. A lot of them are contractual. Like, these companies sign pretty onerous contracts. Yeah. Should those terms be moved into a regulation for the purposes of transparency? Should there be generic terms? I mean, maybe. I don't think there's anything that's going to drive that to happen. I don't think governments are going to do it to make Citizen Lab feel better. Like, it's just not something that's going to do, that's going to happen. And I don't know. I sort of feel like the OffSec sector now, the real problem is, an agency like ICE in the US goes rogue, they can already do infinity damage just with the tools that are currently available. I don't know that expansion of the sector is really a huge risk there. John thinks that there's a proliferation risk there. I think that's a reasonable thing to think. But then you look at what happened to NSO when they behaved badly. Here's one thing John and I both agree on, which is that the Biden White House actually handled this quite well, by taking a bad actor and just singling them out and absolutely going to town on them. Yeah. And in fact, John has this terrific chart of the value of NSO bonds, of their debt, over time, marked with like each event along the timeline, and you just saw it crater. So I think, it would be a brave investor who would pump money into a company that's going to be loosey-goosey with who it sells to. So as I say, it was an interesting conversation. I think he and I agree on most of this stuff, but I don't see them making much progress under the current admin. Let's put it that way.
Seem pretty unlikely. I mean, if they want more, they're absolutely, if anything, they're going to have to relax who can do business in this kind of space and the kind of controls they face, and, adding more vetting and more oversight. Like, that's not really what this administration is going to be all about. So, if they want more, they're going to have to loosen it up and buy elsewhere and accept more collateral damage, like more leaks, more proliferation, more bad stuff happening if you want, just because it's a volume game, right? I mean, there's always going to be people who, for whatever personal reason, ideological, money, whatever it is, go off the rails. And that's happened, before cyber, right? I mean, the Ultra Chains and all of the other kind of like spycraft era stories, same thing can happen here. And, trying to control that, it's kind of a mug game. There is a degree of, you just have to build this stuff, trust that people are going to do it, everyone's going to do a good job, put some sensible controls in, but, they're not ever going to be 100%.
No. When it comes to leaks, no. When it comes to them proliferating this stuff into places where it shouldn't go, I mean, that's a thornier problem. And again, the Biden White House approach seemed like a pretty good one, because it didn't so much rely on regulation as setting norms. I think it will be an enduring thing, at least for a while. I think even under this admin, are you going to go and invest a bunch of money into a spyware company that's going to sell to everyone in the world? Like,
probably not. No.
No, because the government will change eventually, you would think, and you may as well be lighting your money on fire. So I think we're in a better place now, honestly. But it's always good that there are people out there who are concerned about this, like Citizen Lab, and who are doing the work. I think that they serve a very important role, even if I'm not in lockstep with them on absolutely everything.
Yeah, you've got to have people out on the edges of the debate to kind of move the center point around, and I think they do amazing work at Citizen Lab. So, we don't have to see eye to eye on absolutely everything.
Yeah. Now, meanwhile, Memento Labs, which is the company born of the ashes of like HackingTeam, We spoke about how Kaspersky published a report where some of their stuff got snapped on Russian targets. They've come out now and confirmed that was the case, which I think is kind of an odd step from a spyware company. But they've also blamed their customer for using like some of their own old Windows malware, which they're like, we don't even support that stuff anymore. We don't make that. We do mobile. It's kind of funny.
I mean, it's such a wild story because, like, so much of this kind of world is so secretive and so quiet normally. And for the CEO to just come in and go, yeah, that's totally our stuff, is kind of unusual. And then the other little bits, like, we asked our customers to stop using this. Like, you mean you don't have good controls over like licensing and, like you don't know who's got this particular version of it. Like you don't have that kind of level of oversight of your customers. Like that seems a little, a little YOLO as well.
Well, this is where guys like John have a point, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
This is where they have a point, where you've got like, you got your top tier operators who are in really restrictive government contracts with like US agencies and whatever, and everybody knows where they can and can't sell, and like it's all very controlled, and there need to be very rigorous security requirements in place, and again, this isn't transparent stuff, but people who are proximate to people in that business kind of know that this is how it works. And then you got these other guys on the edge who don't have those sort of contracts, who are just like selling it everywhere, whatever, like licensing, are these the next Cobalt Strike beacon, guys? Like who can say?
I also did think like it's kind of a bold move to come out and say, to out yourself as a vendor that's selling tooling to an adversary of Russia at the moment, right? So there's, your stuff's popped up all over Russia, and then to come out and say, hey, that's ours, you're kind of drawing a big arrow to yourself at a time when Russia's going around Novichoking people or whatever else. Like it just I can't imagine he ran this past Corp Comms or past anyone else before he was like, hey, yeah, that was us. Because like I wouldn't do that if it was my bugs being used against Russia successfully. I don't know that I would come out and say, hey, yeah, that was totally me.
Crazy. Anyway, let's move on to some bread and butter InfoSec now. We have some research out of Checkpoint, which looks at some impersonation and spoofing vulnerabilities in Teams. I didn't really go over this one too closely, Adam, but I figured you did, so you can tell us all about it.
Yeah, so this is some research Checkpoint I've been doing like into Teams and just kind of looking for the sorts of bugs that you would use if you were going to do fraud on Teams, or if you were going to do other like social engineering-y kinds of things on Teams. And we've seen plenty of examples of Teams as a vector for social engineering people into like wire transfers or resetting creds or whatever else. So you can communicate from outside a company into their Teams environment and kind of confuse people as the fact that you're not an internal user. Anyway, they were looking for bugs where you can make it look like your name is different, or make it look like a particular message has been. I think one of the ones they had, you can edit a message, and by like fudging the timestamps in the post request, you can edit a message without the edited little tag coming up, so people know that their messages have been changed. They had another one where, like, if you're in a direct message chat with someone, it's the same code base as if you have a group chat, and group chats have kind of titles, subjects or whatever else that you can put in the top of the, of the chat. Those also exist for direct chats, but you can kind of change the title. So at that point, you can make a chat that looks like it's with somebody else, and then you can use that to impersonate your confuse your victim with impersonation. Anyway, they reported some of these bugs to Microsoft middle of last year. Microsoft has now patched some of them out, and it's I'm glad that someone is doing this research, because Teams is a nasty, thickety, thorny mess, and I'm glad I don't have to use it every day now. But yeah, those kinds of things are legitimately useful in quite certain circumstances. So I'm glad someone's looking.
Well, I mean, this is just the world, isn't it, as it is today, where Microsoft, Azure is just a big mainframe, and Teams is just a big instance of IRC that everybody uses, and it's all the same server, kind of, it's just... Yeah. It's
pretty wild. Like the corpse of Skype, reincarnated and necromanced back to life as Teams with a bit of SharePoint bolted on the back. It's just... do not want.
Oh my God, that's just so horrible.
I know,
the reanimated corpse of... reanimated limbs of Skype glued to SharePoint. Woof.
Nasty. So
very nasty. Now, moving on, we're going to chat about some research out of Proofpoint, which looks at cyber-enabled freight theft. It's very interesting stuff. So basically, the idea here is that hackers are getting into some of these, freight brokerage logistics systems, and really just offering to transport cargo, figuring out where they can get a bid, what's in containers or whatever, and figuring out how they can, put themselves forward as a broker and then just turn up in a truck and pick up the container and then take it wherever they want, which is pretty interesting. So funnily enough, though, the write-up here, it's by Ulla Viladsen and Selena Larson. I actually contacted Selena because it wasn't really clear, that last mile of this whole thing. It wasn't really clear how the attackers were getting their hands on the actual cargo. And Selena told me, look, this is actually how they think it's happening, right? So all of these Trojans and, remote access tools are sort of popping up through these logistics systems. And meanwhile, fraud is sort of skyrocketing. And there's been various Reddit threads and even some congressional testimony that makes Proofpoint think that that's actually what's happening, is they're infiltrating this system, figuring out how they can be the ones to pick up a certain amount of cargo, then turning up, load it back on the truck and disappear into the night. So very interesting.
Yeah. But anytime we see a new mechanism for turning cyber into money, like that's always, a good time because, well, not a good time. It's always an interesting time because, turning hacker skills into money is a thing that, there's only so many ways to do it. And once you figure out one that you can scale up and use, then, it tends to drive, the economics then tends to drive the cybercrime and the regular crime around it. So yeah, the idea that you can just like break into these particular organizations and that there is some way to end up getting valuable goods using a computer, which you can then sell. Yeah, it's good. It's good thinking. And it reminded me of, back in 2016, we reported on some pirates around the Horn of Africa that had broken into the management system for a container shipping, shipping container management firms, and we're using that to identify which ships had interesting cargo, where in the manifest, where on the ship it was loaded, and use that to kind of target their piracy more effectively. So yeah, I'm always here for innovation and crime.
Cyber-enabled freight hijacking. Let's go. We're so back. Now, a bit of law and order news. John Grigg reports that a Conti ransomware gang affiliate, he's appeared in court in Tennessee after being extradited from Ireland. He's a Ukrainian national, facing up to 25 years in prison, which I just think it's so crazy that Williams might get away with 10 years-ish for stealing 8 exploit chains from Trenchant. By the way, the rumor is too that the exposures there of various things that, how those bugs were being used, it's a disaster, and he might get 10 years. And meanwhile, this ransomware, junior is looking at 25. It's a funny old world. We've also got a story as a reporting out of Russia. Darina Antonyuk, who's based in Ukraine, has written up this operation where the Russian police detained 3 hackers who are suspected of developing and selling the Medusa Stealer malware. It's just sort of unusual to see this sort of law enforcement action in Russia, which I guess is why it's noteworthy. But the law and order story we're going to dive into this week is one, we're diving into it because Brian Krebs did it, and it's always fun to go through his stories where he just lays everything out in such meticulous detail. Talk to us about this Jabber Zeus coder, Mr. ICQ, who is now in US custody.
That kind of puts a timeline on it, because ICQ is that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. So this was one of the guys behind Jabber Zeus, which was a botnet slash Trojan, I suppose you'd call it, like an in-the-browser Trojan from the early 2010s. And it was one of the real innovators in its world, because they were the first group to really do man-in-the-browser multi-factor auth hijack. And they built some plumbing based on the original Zeus Trojan, and they used Jabber, the communications protocol, to kind of deliver these 2-factor auth tokens into back to the criminals fast enough that they could then use them. And this is one of the guys that developed that particular piece of plumbing. So given how, it's 15 years ago now, finally seeing some justice, I guess, of all the things that have come out of of Russia's war in Ukraine, one of them has been pushing a bunch of Ukrainian cyber criminals out to within reach of law enforcement. And this particular guy was picked up in Italy, now in the US, but was previously in Donetsk in Ukraine, which of course is in Russian hands at the moment. So, the war has pushed a whole bunch of people who were previously insulated by that kind of Commonwealth of independent states bubble out into the West. And Yeah, I mean, Krebs has history with this crew. One of his contacts had infiltrated their Jabber system and was reading their chats. And then Krebs would go around and like notify people that they were about to have their banking details stolen or their accounts broken into by this crew. And he was spending hours a day back in those days, notifying people. And so I think, it's a pretty personal thing for Brian to see, this guy actually, behind bars. And, that's a fun story. And I bet Brian's, probably feels pretty good about it.
Man. Yeah. I do think too that we could see the Russians get their own one day. Like Russia is a country that blows up every now and then politically, right? From the revolution to the collapse of the end of communism there, and like Putin's rise and whatever, like it is constantly in a state of change. And you do wonder, like, okay, say 5-10 years from now, there's an economic collapse. 15 years from now, say there's some sort of bailout required, man, that's going to come with some strings. And these guys are going to be in a lot of trouble, I think. But that's a long time from now, I think. Well, but who knows? That's the wonderful thing. Who knows? Now, I just wanted to update everyone on the Windows, the WSUS stuff. Apparently, there's up to 50 victims of that, according to some work out of Sophos. We've linked through to a cybersecurity dive piece written by David Jones on that. I did have some feedback from a listener, Paul Schnack on Blue Sky, who said, love the show, quick update. A lot of business networks, most use Intune or third-party MDM for Windows updates, not WSUS. I think, Paul, that's probably a little bit optimistic. Like, I think they probably should be using Intune for those sort of patches. But, and then there's, Win Update for Business Now. Auto patch lets you create rings and groups with the binaries coming from Microsoft, not WSUS. Hey, that's the right way to do it. I don't think it is the way that everybody's doing it. He also pointed out that WSUS was deprecated by Microsoft a year ago. I didn't know that, so thanks for letting us know. But, we are seeing a bit of carnage out there with WSUS.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the proof is kind of somewhat in the pudding there, right? That there are people getting owned, and having a quick rummage around. We talked when the story originally broke about some of the things we were seeing on Census. Like, there is quite a lot of stuff out there on the internet that really does look like it's still WSUS. And people are having a bad time. But yeah, Intune, a lot of people struggle with deploying that.
It's hard.
Yeah,
it's hard.
Exactly,
that's why
right.
Devicey exists, which is an Australian company that sort of helps people manage it, right? Because like it's hard. It's good plumbing, but they put in the pipes, they didn't put in the taps. I think it's the best way you can kind of describe Intune. I'm sure it's better, and I'm sure that for some of these Microsoft super admins, they find it pretty easy, but most people don't, as you point out. So we also had a YouTube comment from Cal Feher, Feher. So I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation there. I hope it is, Cal. He says, I think your recollection of the Kaminsky bug is a little off. UDP source port randomization was most certainly already available and was the default in bind at that time. Cal, that's actually what we said, mate. We said that there was some source port randomization, but it was insufficient. He continues, however, the port range was limited and it was a common configuration to actually fix the source port to a single value. Didn't know that. You probably did, Adam. The limited variable range was an oopsie from ISC. The dodgy config was simply evidence that people do dumb things. The true fix, even back then, was DNSSEC. This was also reflected in the comms from ISC at the time, but back then DNSSEC was hard and not considered a reasonable mitigation in a short time frame. Not letting the crisis go to waste, there was finally some energy in the DNS community to improve DNSSEC usability and improve the protocol as a whole. Thanks, Dan, he said. Now, the reason I'm talking about this comment is it is hysterical that we received this comment that the true fix was DNSSEC. A few days after, look, some people listening to this might have noticed that we had a very, very brief outage over the weekend. It was a planned outage. Adam, why did we have an outage over the weekend?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that it was a DNSSEC.
Well, it was that we disabled DNSSEC. We had to disable DNSSEC. And why did you tell people why we have to disable DNSSEC?
We have to disable DNSSEC because in order to be able to issue Let's Encrypt certs or other dynamically rolled domain validated certs, we need to be able to, have our zone file exposed to changes from inside our infrastructure provider, which is DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean doesn't support DNSSEC. We had to move our zone from another provider, which does support DNSSEC, into DigitalOcean so that we can do automated certificate renewal because browsers are going to, we're not going to be able to, roll a cert once a year by hand anymore. We have to do it, automatically as is best practice. But to do that, of course, we had to turn off DNSSEC. And the process of turning off DNSSEC resulted in a, couple 2 to 3 hour outage of our DNS. But only
in some places. Only
if you were the sort of person that's going through a resolver that does actually validate the DNSSEC, which is not very many people. Numbers are something like 3% of the internet resolves DNS in a way that actually validates DNSSEC. So in whatever time this bind, the Kaminsky cache poisoning bug was, which is like mid-2000s, it was certainly a lot less than 3%. And now in 2025, there are very, very, very few people who actually will have their DNS lookups fail because the DNSSEC has misconfigured key material or has something wrong with it. So
it's the only way we can get a Let's Encrypt certificate into our CDN. Is to be doing this. Like, it is the only way. We went around and around on ways to do it. So it's just real funny that we get this comment about how the true solution and the future is DNSSEC, like literally like the day or a day after, like we had to disable DNSSEC. We had to disable our encryption so that we could get encryption, basically. Yeah. And, I think really we're in a Let's Encrypt TLS-based world. And, I don't know, man. DNSSEC, it sort of feels like Linux on the desktop. You know what I mean? Like, it's coming next year. It's coming next year.
Except that Linux on the desktop is actually usable, whereas DNSSEC, honestly, is mostly just about causing outages. So
yeah. Well, mate, that is actually it for the week's news. Thank you so much for joining me for a fascinating discussion, as always. And, I look forward to doing it again next week.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. I will see you then.
That was Adam Boileau there with a check of the week's security news. Big thanks to him for that. It was a good one this week. So we are going to hear from Scott Kufer now, who is the chief executive and co-founder of Nucleus Security, which makes a vulnerability management platform. As I mentioned at the intro, you can get it to ingest all of the vulnerability scan information from your scanners. Even if you're using lots of different scanners, you can pull in information from Run Zero, from all of your SAST stuff. Like, it all comes into one place. It gets normalized. You can start slicing and dicing that data, sending it off to the correct teams. There's Slack integrations, all that sort of stuff. But what I wanted to talk to Scott about today, a couple things really, but the first thing we started speaking about was this idea that prioritizing bug fixes will save us, right? That will take this unmanageable problem and make it a manageable problem. It's not panning out that way. People are now at the point where they can no longer keep up with even the high priority bugs in their organization. And, he thinks we need to start thinking of some different approaches. And he makes some good points. So here's Scott Kufer from Nucleus Security.
What we're seeing is that there's actually just been a shift in how organizations talk about vulnerabilities, and there's more data that's being presented all of the time. And so it's really more of a volume issue. It's not necessarily that we're getting worse at fixing individual vulnerabilities. We're getting worse in aggregate at fixing the new numbers of vulnerabilities that are coming in, if that makes sense, right? So it's really like
the deluge is just getting bigger, and like the ability to respond is not keeping up. Is that kind of the vibe?
That's correct. And then the variety is also getting bigger, right? So 10 years ago, the only remediation that a vulnerability analyst had to worry about was really patch management and all those pesky certificate vulnerabilities that came out of your Tenable console. And now, then you spun up the cloud security teams, and you spun up the DevOps teams and development, and we're seeing a convergence of all of those. And so now individual vulnerability teams are responsible for the entire cloud stack, not just individual IT stacks. And so you're really seeing a lot of friction in the process related to the volume of just vulnerabilities in general. I mean, everybody talks all the time about how, hey, we're seeing more new vulnerabilities discovered all the time than we've ever seen. So that is increasing. But I think the bigger issue is actually that we're seeing that across all of the different categories of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so I guess we shouldn't be surprised that scale in vulnerability remediation is a problem, right? Because we've just got like this deluge more and more and more and more in everything all the time. What has been the approach over the last 5 years in terms of trying to speed that up, right? Because it feels like for the past 5 years, the approach has really been about trying to just figure out where your exposure is instead of trying to fix everything. But like, it almost feels like that can only get you so far as well, because even those genuine exposure numbers are kind of ballooning. Is that roughly like kind of where we are?
I would say so. It's what's interesting about it is that when you think about, we call it the remediation economy, right? So there's basically this optimization from economics that occurs where you're trying to think about, well, what is the optimal amount of risk for me to fix in my business? And we don't really put a lot of stock into that as a operational concept, right? So we generally, look at vulnerabilities in terms of lists, right? Here's my giant number of things that I need to look at. And the approach has been, how do we just whittle that down to the point where we only look at the 5% that matter? And that works really well until the 5% that matter are more than what you can actually physically fix, right? And so we've invested
that's kind of what I mean, right? Is because for a long time people have said, the solution is just forget about these ones where there's no path for someone to exploit them, and just patch the ones that are genuine exposures. And it's like, that works really well until that number also gets unmanageable.
Absolutely. And I would say that that's the point that we're approaching, especially when we look at the amount of just, I hate to do this, but to talk about how AI is starting to change the game of what we're seeing with some of these things, right? It's become a bigger and bigger topic that we're seeing, to the point where folks are even asking questions about how do you audit your AI models, right? And so eventually those are going to turn into vulnerabilities and exposures that you then have to manage as a vulnerability team, right? And so it's a whole new category, brave new world of where we're at with the types of things that we have to manage, and nobody knows how to deal with that right now.
Well, that was going to be my next question, is how do we deal with that, right? Because as I say, it's been the way, right, is to whittle down, the number of bugs that you actually remediate. Now we're starting to hit some limits there. I mean, obviously there's going to be people proposing like AI as a solution to this somehow. I think that's going to be tough, to be honest. Like right now, I think, excuse me, patching is just, it's just one of those things that's very, very hard. I think it's difficult to automate. It's difficult to instrument. So, what are some possible directions here that you might see happening over the next few years?
Yeah, one concept that was pitched to me not that long ago, there was this other startup that was really trying to sell me on the idea of like a CIS benchmarking concept, but for like AI prompts. So effectively like looking at how your AI coding agents are basically set up, especially with the new OpenAI coding agent, and basically being able to say, how can we audit that the thing has been optimized to put out the most high quality and structured code that we can be comfortable with.
Well, hang on. When I say, by the way, when I say that AI won't fix patching, I mean, in that, I'm very much speaking about operating systems and applications on a desktop.
Totally.
And, server infrastructure. When it comes to actually in-house apps, like, I do think AI is probably going to solve that problem, right? So that vibes with what you're saying there.
I look forward to the day. That would be great for everybody, for sure. But yeah, it's a good question. As far as it relates to operating systems, that one thing that folks are starting to get really bullish on, which I'm still hesitant to be bullish on, by the way. So I'm saying this as basically just delivering the message versus being
here's what people are saying. Don't agree, but that's what they're saying.
Right. So I'm starting to see a bigger push towards, well, before we couldn't patch everything because we didn't want to automate patches, right? Because it was risky. We needed a change management process, all of these things. And so there's a lot of optimism in the IT space, from what I can see, that maybe we can make better decisions about what patches to push out automatically because they're low risk, and we can use these AI agents to basically make those decisions for us to start to decrease basically the amount that it costs to fix every single vulnerability. Is kind of the idea that folks are really pushing towards. How do we make it cheaper and faster to fix vulnerabilities and without having to have humans in the loop? And, there's probably some validity to that, but as somebody who worked in the federal government and in large enterprises, I hear that, and folks just start to cringe internally, right? Because change management.
So here's my issue with that, right? Which is, why do you need AI for that part? Like it doesn't seem to me that the missing piece from what you just described is like going to be filled with AI. I mean, it's just a fiddly, horrible, unpredictable thing, which is why 100%. It's hard.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I view it very much as everybody is super excited right now about the AI hype train. But the reality is most of what you're trying to automate is declarative automation, right? Like you want that pipeline to just be basically spinning out 50 widgets a minute, and you don't want to have to think about it and look at it, right? And so I view it as very high risk, realistically, to try to use this thing that's using probabilities to guess what you're trying to do all the time. And so what I think we're going to start to see is these kind of separate models of pipelines. And we're starting to see this in the software development lifecycle as well, which is basically like there are some bugs that we just auto fix, right? And they're like lower risk, lower effort, easier things and systems that already exist, versus like, hey, we actually have a whole separate SDLC to have humans look at it, but they're both assessed, right? So how do you set up those pipelines to audit what's actually happening? And I imagine that IT teams are looking at something very similar to that in certain scenarios. But I don't think there's a good answer.
It's interesting. It's interesting what you say, because we were really looking at, where are the exposures, high impact exposures? Let's deal with them. And I suppose another way to measure, another measurement you should apply, or a metric you should apply to a bug, is like, how easy and trivial is it to fix? And if it is easy and trivial to fix, you should just go ahead and auto do it.
Right. And those that have worked in engineering before know that that is a really hard question to answer, right? And so, that entire estimation process is built around that, and we get it wrong, 5 times out of 10. So, just solving that itself is really challenging. But yeah, conceivably you could get to a point where it's super easy to fix, super low risk, just do it, right? And it's the volume game over the super precise precision game. And I think the reality is we need to do both. And how do we optimize a larger program for both is going to be really the name of the game going forward.
Now, it would be crazy of me to have you here and not ask you what you think of what is happening in the sort of code-sec space with all of these AI models. OpenAI made big waves with its Aardvark stuff. We've just talked about that in the news. But I wanted to get your opinion, I guess, on these, on how much of a solved problem a lot of these, application vulnerabilities are, because I think this stuff is amazing. I think people do underestimate it. I say that because a guy I know, a founder, said to me 6 months ago, he started playing around with using some of the models to do code audits, and he said, it's over. Like, those were his words. He's like, I'm not even going to try to build a business on this. I'm not going to try to raise on this. It is over. This is a market segment that won't exist in a couple of years. You would be seeing, basically, because you're doing all this vulnerability aggregation and stuff in large organizations, do you see them yet starting to use these models in their applications development and then just bugs disappearing? Like, what are you seeing from your perspective in terms of how these AI models are playing out, doing code audits and stuff and fixing bugs?
Yeah, I would say, we see it, but not at a super widespread scale. I do think that, anybody, again, like, if you've historically worked in the AppSec space and you've tried to discover vulnerabilities, like even just business logic vulnerabilities using SAST, like, everybody knows that was a really challenging space because there's so many false positives. It was really hard to understand what's really going on in the code base. And so,
well, I don't think the AI stuff is very good at logic vulnerabilities either, but certainly in terms of like cleanness of code and whatever, those sort of bugs, like, very good.
It's really good at certain things, and I think it's only going to get better, right? Our CTO is really bullish on AI coding agents as well. But I would agree that within a few years we will see a super widespread adoption of this, because it's going to end up being more efficient and effective to do that. And these things will get better. And I just feel like we're hitting upper limits with some of these traditional tools, and specifically around discovering and assessing the risk of vulnerabilities and exposures in code versus, like, how does this thing trace through the app, right? We looked at Nucleus at building, like, tracing information through, like, how code is executing for ourselves, so that we could help to try to build some of that intelligence layer around these different and distinct code bases coming together and microservices and all that. And it's like, just for us to be able to now build a capability to do that. It's super easy for us to do something like that now, and a lot more accessible to other companies that aren't just like SaaS companies or SEA companies. So I think we're going to see a lot more capabilities become available to broader sets of organizations. Like, for all we know, we could see Fortinet dropping some new products to do stuff like that. Like, that's how much easier it's gotten to make that happen. And it would be very dumb not to say that that's going to make a huge impact in the market kind of over the long term, right? So I would agree with your founder friend who would say the same. Who said that.
Yeah. He's just like, I'm not raising on this. This is like, no, there's no moat here. All right, Scott Kufer, thank you so much for joining me for this interview. A pleasure to chat to you. Cheers.
You as well. Thanks, man.
That was Scott Kufer there from Nucleus Security. Big thanks to them for that. And that is it for this week's show. I do hope you enjoyed it. I will be back next week with more security news and analysis. But until then, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.